I'm honored to be here today to speak about the historical challenges and problems with the Department of Homeland Security and two of its largest components, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which includes the Border Patrol, and the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE. I'm a journalist and historian. I've written multiple books focused on federal law enforcement, national security, and American government, one of which, about Watergate, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, and published dozens of articles in places like Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic about DHS, the Justice Department, and federal law enforcement, including the FBI, CBP, and ICE. My testimony today draws upon that extensive previous reporting and is informed by literally hundreds of conversations with agents and executives at all levels of federal law enforcement, including scores of interviews with agents and officers of ICE and CBP. I've interviewed CBP commissioners and ICE directors in their executive suites, been on patrol with the Border Patrol, ridden on their boats, and flown in their helicopters, shared meals with union officials, and been in the studio while they recorded their popular podcast, and observed as Border Patrol apprehended migrants crossing the Texas-Mexico border. My goal today is to outline for the Commission some of the history of ICE and CBP, and in particular to outline what has changed and what is changing as the Trump administration floods both agencies with money from the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. What I hope you will take away from my testimony today is that the problems, abuses, scandals, and controversies involving CBP and ICE that have been on display over the last year in far too many American cities and social media feeds, from deadly shootings and agent brutality to the routine abuse of constitutional and civil rights and liberties, is entirely consistent with long-identified problems in CBP and ICE that have gone ignored and uncorrected both by a generation of Congress and multiple Democratic and Republican administrations alike. These are not aberrations. These incidents are the entirely foreseeable consequence of how the nation has approached immigration enforcement since 9/11 and the creation of DHS. In particular, CBP has been likely the deadliest and certainly the most troubled federal law enforcement agency for the better part of 2 decades now. Since 9/11, the culture of ICE and CBP has meant that the agencies have been what you might call a fascist secret police in waiting, troubled agencies simply waiting for an ambitious would-be authoritarian. ICE is an agency whose recruiting and training standards are so low that other federal law enforcement agents say pejoratively that ICE is hired, quote, hired by the pound from the pound. And the paramilitary CBP especially has been uniquely callous with human life and suffers from a deeply ingrained culture of racism and misogyny, all of which is enabled by an all but unequaled and long-standing sense of impunity. CBP, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, has been plagued for 2 decades by a tidal wave of crime, corruption, and misconduct, driven by a disastrous post-9/11 hiring surge that flooded the force with thousands of agents and officers who should have never been given a badge and gun, including, as one CBP commissioner told me, even accidentally hiring members of actual drug cartels. Criminality is so rampant inside CBP that it has seen one of its own agents or officers arrested every 24 to 36 hours since 2005. CBP's misconduct scandal is so long-running that today it would be old enough to drink. In total, according to CBP's own discipline reports, over the 20 years from 2005 to 2024, the last year numbers are available, at least 4,913 CBP officers and agents have been arrested themselves, some multiple times. In 2018 alone, a single CBP employee was arrested 5 times. To put that number in perspective, The population of CBP agents and officers who have been arrested would make it roughly the nation's 4th largest police department, equal in size to the entire Philadelphia police. Indeed, for much of the 2010s and likely before and since, it appears that the crime rate of CBP agents and officers was higher per capita than the crime rate of undocumented immigrants in the United States. Before I dive into the details, I want to add an overarching caveat. None of what I'm about to say is meant to imply that everything was hunky-dory in DHS until noon on January 20th last year when Donald Trump returned to the presidency. Quite the opposite. And yet something was fundamentally different before last year. ICE and CBP managed to go about their work in such a way that didn't cause ordinary law-abiding U.S. citizens to fear for their lives. ICE or CBP agents didn't routinely operate wearing masks and deploy tear gas daily against U.S. citizens. The entire school systems of major U.S. cities didn't have to close in fear of CBP and ICE operations targeting their communities. And professional sports leagues like the NBA didn't have to cancel games because of CBP and ICE violence in their cities. Something has changed, and my hope is that this testimony will help explain what and how. First, how history plagues CBP and ICE. On September 11, 2001, immigration was the purview of the Justice Department's Immigration and Naturalization Service, while Border Trade and Travel was the responsibility of the Treasury Department's U.S. Customs Service. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks and as part of the creation of DHS and the massive reshuffling of government, both INS and Customs were broken apart. ICE brought together what was known as the Legacy INS Deportation and Detention Officers, which were renamed as what's now known as Enforcement and Removal Operations, ICE ERO, as well as the Legacy INS and Legacy Customs Special Agents to form the Homeland Security Investigations Division, ICE HSI. Other parts of INS and Customs were reshuffled into the new supposedly unified border agency of Customs and Border Protection. The green uniformed Border Patrol were in charge of patrolling the border in between legal ports of entry, while a team made up of legacy customs inspectors and USDA agriculture inspectors were combined and renamed into the blue uniformed Office of Field Operations to handle legitimate trade and travel through ports of entry like land crossings, seaports, and airports. One of the first things Congress did with the new agency was to supercharge its hiring. The agency's own studies concluded that the Border Patrol did not have operational control over 97% of the U.S. border. Altogether, the border before 9/11 was so porous that in 2000, a 3-ton American elephant named Benny appeared in a Mexico City circus, only for U.S. authorities to discover that there was no record the elephant had ever crossed the U.S. border. The plan to remedy this lack of control was audacious and remarkably ill-conceived. During the 8 years of the Bush administration, the Border Patrol surged from 9,200 agents in 2001 to some 18,000 agents, and a number that eventually peaked in the Obama administration at 21,000 agents. Add in the officers of the Office of Field Operations and the Air and Marine officers, and CBP had a gun-carrying workforce of about 45,000 agents and officers. There was plenty of evidence, even before the hiring surge, to believe it was a bad idea. Police departments in Miami, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. had all been beset by systemic misconduct scandals after they tried to grow their force rapidly in the 1980s and 90s. The Border Patrol hiring surge would be no different. The surge meant the agency had to search far and wide for increasingly less qualified candidates. The agency raised its recruiting age from 37 to 40 and regularly sent new agents through the academy and even out into the field before completing full background checks. Agents in the field pejoratively referred to the new hires as no trainee left behind. By the end of the Bush administration, more than half of the Border Patrol had been in the field for less than 2 years. This hiring surge collided with two other fundamental and foundational problems with CBP: its legal authorities and its culture. Understanding both ICE and CBP requires starting with the difference between two U.S. government job codes, known as 1811s versus 1801s. So-called GS 1801s are the federal government's street cops, the bottom ranks of law enforcement. These positions come with less training and lower educational requirements, usually only a high school degree or equivalent, as well as more limited arrest authority. All of CBP, including both the Border Patrol and Office of Field Operations, are 1801s, as are all ICE ERO officers. All of them have strictly limited arrest powers. Then there are GS 1811 positions, known as Special Agent Criminal Investigators. These are the government's detectives. Think the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, and notably, ICE HSI officers. HSI agents. These positions usually require more work experience and a college degree and come with far more training and more broad investigative authority. This difference may seem minor, but it's incredibly important in understanding why CBP and ICE are as rogue and poorly trained as they are. For one thing, that subtle difference in job code meant that CBP was entirely set up as 1801s, which inadvertently meant that it had no authority or power to investigate wrongdoing by its own agents and workforce. To make that point more sharply, in the post-9/11 reorganization, we created the nation's largest law enforcement agency and didn't give it the power to have the internal affairs capacity that even one would expect at a mid-sized local police department. It was a key ingredient in this recipe for disaster, and one that would not be fixed until the final months of the Obama administration, more than a decade after the creation of DHS. Which brings me to the third fundamental challenge and problem with CBP, and especially the Border Patrol. Its fiercely independent and closed-rank culture and tradition, born of policing and protecting a largely unpopulated, harsh, and isolated region along the U.S.-Mexican border. The Border Patrol is culturally and traditionally something akin to what I've described as part police force, part occupying army, and part frontier cavalry. The traditional job of Border Patrol agents is hard. They often work alone or in pairs in rural, rugged terrain, with backup and help often miles and sometimes an hour or more away. Agents developed a strong tradition of frontier-style justice. Its agency motto, honor first, is as much a statement of machismo as it is about integrity. This fierce independence manifests itself in distinct areas worthy of note, which combine to make it particularly susceptible for a would-be authoritarian. Its approach to its daily work and use of force, a deep-seated institutional culture of racism and misogyny, and a pugilistic approach to national politics. This is an agency that is uniquely callous about human lives, both of U.S. citizens and migrants. It is, as best as anyone can determine, perhaps the nation's deadliest law enforcement agency. It is notoriously hard to understand federal law enforcement shootings, but since 2010, CBP agents have been involved in at least 72 deadly shootings or use of force incidents. An internal report in 2013 that the agency tried to keep secret accused agents of shooting their weapons not out of fear, but of frustration. In 2013, a report by the Police Executive Research Forum examined 67 incidents and found that too many cases do not appear to meet the test of objective reasonableness with regard to the use of deadly force. Agents are emboldened in their use of force by a sense that there will never be consequences for doing so. Roughly 96 or 97% of complaints against Border Patrol historically have gone nowhere. In fact, across a 4-year period from 2012 to 2015 that included 2,178 complaints that warranted further investigation, just 11 resulted in an agent's temporary suspension, and 11 more resulted in a reprimand. Only one out of 2,178 complaints led to an agent's resignation. If you do that math, that works out to be that across the entire Border Patrol, about 3 agents a year received a formal disciplinary reprimand. If agents act like they can get away with anything, the statistics back them up. The racist and nativist roots of the Border Patrol are well known. But what is remarkable is how the seeping cultural corruption since 9/11 has taken an agency founded a century ago to enforce explicitly racist and nativist policies and managed to make it even more racist and misogynist. In 2017, CBP officers at Newark Airport set up a rape table at the New Jersey airport where they would sexually assault other officers. In 2019, ProPublica uncovered a racist Facebook group made up of some 9,500 current and former Border Patrol agents and leaders, including the then chief of the Border Patrol. As ProPublica wrote, current and former Border Patrol agents mocked dead migrants, called congresswomen scumbuckets, and uploaded misogynistic images. This underlying racism, misogyny, and nativism has contributed to the third area of the Border Patrol's culture I'd like to address: its unusually pugilistic participation in national politics. The Border Patrol Union has particularly resisted transparency efforts and attempts to rein in use of force. When CBP announced it would recognize officer and agents who de-escalated confrontations and avoided using deadly force, the union called the new award despicable. The union has also especially carved out a unique relationship with Donald Trump since the earliest days of his presidential campaign. It was the first union to endorse Trump, later followed by ICE's union, and Donald Trump actually first wore his now signature Make America Great Again hat during a summer 2015 tour of the border initiated by local Border Patrol union officials. It wouldn't surprise any seasoned law enforcement leader doubling the size of CBP without adequate vetting, training, oversight, or management led to a host of problems, not the least of which was the stunning arrest statistics I cited earlier. In 2016, in the final months of the Obama administration, a period that actually represented the peak of reform and professionalization for CBP, an outside advisory group headed by NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton concluded that the CBP discipline system is broken. Bratton's advisory group noted that CBP's discipline system was less rigorous for its armed officers than the TSA's discipline system was for its unarmed security screeners. Hugely elevated misconduct, crime, and corruption problems continue to dog CBP to this day. Overall, CBP's arrest and misconduct rate is 5 times higher than other federal law enforcement agencies. CBP's corruption problem was so bad that DHS leadership under Secretary Janet Napolitano ordered CBP to change its definition of corruption to downplay to Congress the breadth of the problem. U.S. law enforcement has never experienced a scandal as big, as far-reaching, destructive, and as far-lasting as the wave of corruption and criminality that has overtaken CBP and the Border Patrol since 2005. It's a story that too much of the public still doesn't know and too many policymakers still don't understand. Let me add one caveat here. It's not my goal here to paint all of CBP with a brush of misconduct, racism, and corruption. Many agents and officers are excellent, serving our nation in hard jobs in the best possible tradition. But as one female agent told Mother Jones magazine in 2024, "I was a loyal agent and employee for 27 years, and I see the good in the agency. But I can't deny that the worst I've seen has come at the hands of the agents and not the criminals we're supposed to arrest. Now let me turn my attention for a moment to ICE. In the reshuffling of DHS, ICE got the job that no one wanted. Immigration enforcement domestically is arguably the country's most fraught and unsettled policy area. For most of its roughly 20 years of existence, ICE has faced a clear problem. There are way more undocumented immigrants in the United States than Congress funded ICE to find, arrest, and deport. For many years, ICE was budgeted for around 400,000 deportations annually. ICE's ERO side has long relied upon and focused heavily on what's known as prosecutorial discretion. Under that strategy, ICE ERO mostly focused on deporting people with a so-called final order of removal, e.g. people who had exhausted all the legal process and ignored the binding decision of the immigration courts to leave the country, or people with criminal records above and beyond simply being undocumented. The much talked about murderers, drug smugglers, gang members, and human traffickers, who are always cited as the Trump administration's main targets. The strategy of discretion worked. By 2011, nearly half of the 400,000 people deported by ICE had a criminal conviction, up from only a third in 2008. That work, though, was manpower intensive, but it also meant that they were making a real difference in terms of crime in the United States. They were actually finding, arresting, and deporting the worst of the worst, while for the most part leaving the day laborers and abuelas alone to await whatever political solution to America's immigration crisis Congress could someday find. Then Donald Trump was elected president. Today, that prosecutorial discretion is out the window. Last spring, Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller set an arbitrary target of around 1 million deportations a year, which translates into immigration officers making 3,000 arrests a day. That new quota meant ICE and CBP had to abandon any pretext of targeted enforcement operations. It took too long and required too many officers. Those raids where Greg Bovino's heavily armed CBP agents stormed into Home Depot parking lots are a necessity of this new quota system because it's the low-hanging fruit of immigration enforcement. Similarly, ICE and CBP officers around the country, and particularly in targeted operations in places like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis, are stopping, detaining, and deporting people with no criminal records who are following all legal procedures for their asylum, immigration, or citizenship proceedings. These actions aren't because any of these immigrants pose a threat to the United States. It's because they're easy pickings. And ICE and CBP have embraced quantity over quality. The terror and trauma of these arrests is the point, not the safety of the United States. That shift is reflected in how most people now detained by ICE have no criminal record. A Cato Institute roundup in November found that nearly 3 in 4 have a conviction, and just 5% have a violent criminal conviction. This is not how ICE has traditionally been used, and CBP wasn't supposed to be routinely policing the streets and cities. The Border Patrol and ICE are just not trained, prepared, or accustomed to patrolling regular America and rolling through neighborhoods, school grounds, and parking lots. Not regular police, and they don't know how to behave or navigate urban civilian environments. They don't have the muscle memory or de-escalation skills of dealing with innocent police. It's they lack real-world policing skills. The fact that they're instead approaching their work not as law enforcement, but as an occupation military force is clear in the language officials are using. Yesterday alone, we saw Greg Bovino give an attaboy video calling for agents to turn and burn. And Border Czar Tom Homan referred to agents deploying to Minneapolis as being in theater. This is not the mentality we want guiding or inspiring a federal law enforcement. Their poor training and sense of political impunity is contributing to and driving their arrest first and question later approach, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect in a free and democratic society. and it has had entirely predictable outcomes. ProPublica found in October that more than 170 U.S. citizens have been arrested by immigration authorities, some disappearing into ICE's apparatus for days incommunicado. Sometimes I believe that American exceptionalism, the sense that it can't happen here, the realities of our current political life. The behavior of ICE and CBP over the last year is one such case. In any other foreign country, a U.S. reporter was writing about these raids in or Minneapolis, we wouldn't hesitate or CBP, a paramilitary force loyal to the regime, or a masked right-wing militia. And as an even larger cohort of qualified and less trained ICE and CBP officers begins to hit the streets, this is almost all certainly going to get worse. I want to focus my final section of remarks about what we can expect in the months to come as ICE and CBP together see a flood of funding that is unprecedented. In 2014, my Border Patrol reporting was titled The Green Monster. Today, we're creating something even more dangerous to our country, a masked monster of a law enforcement agency, one uniquely unsuited for its new power, authority, reach, and funding levels. This time, unlike that money for the Border Patrol after 9/11, ICE's giant new supercharged ranks will be focused not on America's borders, but on our streets, neighborhoods, and businesses. We are set as a nation to repeat every single mistake that we made after 9/11 with CBP, but worse. The goal for growing ICE with 10,000 new officers is both a larger total number than the Border Patrol tried to hire during its surge, and also represents a larger total percentage of the existing ICE force. ICE is set to receive some $30 billion in new funding for this hiring. Moreover, we should have specific fresh concern about who is applying for these new jobs at ICE and CBP, which also plans to hire thousands of new agents. Today, DHS and ICE are relying on explicitly white nationalist rhetoric and imagery in their promotion materials. As one of the first moves to revamp its training, ICE proved that it's building a Trump cult of personality as much as it's hiring for a law enforcement agency. It cut its previous 5-month training academy to just 47 days, a period chosen, according to what 3 officials told The Atlantic, because Donald Trump is the 47th president. ICE is no longer interviewing candidates before hiring them and swearing them in virtually, promising that it will catch up on background checks later. The training has already been cut at 42 days to speed getting officers into the field. Lastly, news headlines are also beginning to feel eerily familiar about what the early warning signs of CBP's tidal wave of misconduct and criminality looked like in the late 2000s. There are major warning signs that ICE's workforce has a similar misconduct problem today. Last month, a detention officer at an ICE facility in Louisiana pleaded guilty to raping a Nicaraguan detainee for months. On New Year's Eve, shot and killed a man in Los Angeles, and has been accused of allegedly whipping his sons with a belt and making racist and homophobic remarks. Again, this hiring surge is just getting started. I want to raise 2 specific new concerns that I see looming on the horizon that I've not addressed elsewhere today. First is ICE and CBP's giant investment in deployment of surveillance technologies, some of which has been leading to mistaken arrests in the field, and much of which, as currently envisioned, is not consistent with policing in a free society. ICE is extensively using data mining and facial recognition technology. In particular, it's relying upon a facial recognition app known as Mobile Fortify, and claiming that the app is the be-all and end-all of someone is in the United States. The There are multiple documented instances where this app has returned false or contradictory information, and yet ICE has relied on it to make detentions and arrests. Second, I have not spoken much about ICE's detention centers. The Trump administration and ICE are in the midst of an enormously ambitious plan to double the capacity of detention facilities, from about 55,000 beds to more than 107 beds, as part of a plan to pour about $45 billion into detention. I would expect and predict that over the course of 2026, we will see this plan become the centerpiece. Let me leave you today with a final point. This doesn't change unless we demand change and make it change. The way that the funding for ICE has been allocated, it can spend that money straight through to 2029. Congress is going to have to act to turn that funding and hiring spigot off. Otherwise, this continues on autopilot for the next 4 years. The country will be long-lasting. Remember, we are 2 decades removed from the start of the CBP hiring surge, and I can still find you a news story and headline every day that traces its origins back to the mistakes made at that time. We as a nation must act to change the trajectory of immigration enforcement in our country. America cannot survive as a free society if ICE and CBP continue to operate as they have over the last year, let alone as both agencies are turbocharged and empowered with more funding, more officers, more guns, and more arrests. Thank you for your time today.